In the theater of modern conflict, the first casualty is not truth, but clarity. Truth can be recovered, pieced together from fragments and whispers. Clarity, however, once deliberately shattered, is almost impossible to restore. It is replaced by a fog, a pervasive and intentional mist of confusion where facts and fiction blur into an indistinguishable gray. And it is in this fog that the greatest deceptions are allowed to fester. Consider the events of September 26, 2022. Beneath the cold, churning waters of the Baltic Sea, a series of explosions tore through the Nord Stream pipelines. This was not a leak. It was a violent, deliberate act of infrastructure terrorism on a scale unseen in modern European history. The immediate question on everyone's lips was, who? But that was the wrong question. It was the question they wanted you to ask. It was the entry point to their labyrinth of lies. The opening act of this grand deception was as predictable as it was insulting to our intelligence. Within hours before any meaningful investigation could possibly have begun, a chorus of voices from the mainstream press and Western political chancelleries rose in near-perfect unison. The finger pointed squarely, unhesitatingly, at Moscow. You were shown the headlines, flashed across your screens from London to New York. Russia, they claimed, had committed an act of spectacular self-sabotage. Let us pause here and appreciate the sheer audacity of this initial narrative. You were asked to believe that a nation would destroy its own multi-billion-dollar asset, its most potent piece of economic leverage over Europe, and its primary source of future gas revenue. Why? The reason offered was that Russia sought to create instability or weaponize energy. But Russia already held the ultimate weapon, the off switch. They could simply turn the valve, as they had threatened to do, cutting off the flow without destroying their own property. It is the logic of a gas station owner burning down his own pumps to protest the price of oil. It is a premise that collapses under the slightest scrutiny, yet it was served to the world as the unquestionable truth. This wasn't an explanation, it was a loyalty test. They were testing to see if you would swallow the absurd. When this line of reasoning proved too thin even for the most compliant observer, the scriptwriters in the shadows moved to Act 2. The magician, having failed to convince you his assistant truly vanished, needed a new distraction. And so, months later, a new fairy tale was seeded into the global consciousness. A story so comically amateurish it could only have been designed to further muddy the waters. Enter the Andromeda, a modest sailing yacht, allegedly chartered by a mysterious pro-Ukrainian group of 6 individuals who, according to this new official story, navigated the treacherous Baltic, dove to a depth of 80 meters with hundreds of kilograms of military-grade explosives, and executed a deep-sea demolition operation worthy of a highly trained Naval Special Forces unit. This is not a theory. This is a screenplay for a bad spy movie. The logistics are a fantasy. The required amount of explosives would have filled a significant portion of the yacht itself. The technical expertise needed for such a deep, coordinated saturation dive is the exclusive domain of a handful of state militaries. The notion that such an operation could be planned and executed from a rented pleasure boat without the knowledge and support of a major intelligence agency is a grotesque insult. The story of the Andromeda was never meant to be believed. It was designed to be a plausible-sounding dead end, a black hole for journalistic inquiry. It was the perfect tool to bury the investigation, allowing officials in Germany, Sweden, and Denmark to shrug their shoulders and say, the investigation is ongoing, but the trail leads to a complex and shadowy group. The case could then be quietly closed, with no state actor ever held responsible. Do you see the pattern now? The shift from blaming a superpower to blaming a ragtag group on a sailboat is not the sign of a progressing investigation. It is the hallmark of a cover-up. When you don't want to find the real answer, you create a storm of conflicting, implausible alternatives. You create noise. You engineer chaos. The goal is to exhaust the public's attention span, to make the truth seem so convoluted and out of reach that people simply give up and accept the comfortable ambiguity. They are not just attacking a pipeline, they are attacking your capacity for critical thought. They are counting on the fact that if a lie is repeated enough by trusted faces on evening news broadcasts, it will eventually be accepted as a plausible version of reality. And in the center of this manufactured storm stands the most damning evidence of all, the deafening silence. The governments of Europe, particularly Germany, whose industrial heart was directly targeted, have responded to this unprecedented act of economic warfare not with outrage, but with a quiet, submissive restraint. Imagine if a foreign power bombed the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz. The response would be immediate and earth-shattering. Yet, when the economic artery of the continent's largest economy was severed, its leaders mumbled platitudes and hid behind stalled investigations. This is not the behavior of a sovereign entity that has been attacked. It is the behavior of a hostage who knows who their captor is but dare not speak their name aloud. It is the silence of complicity, born from the terrifying realization that the hand that fed them was also the hand that held the detonator. But if it wasn't Russia and the yacht story is a farce, what powerful hand truly lit the fuse on the Baltic seabed? To answer that, we must follow the golden rule of any investigation. Follow the money, and follow the power. Cui bono? Who benefits? The question we were left with was cui bono? Who benefits? In the labyrinth of global power, this is the one thread that, if pulled, will unravel the entire tapestry of deception. Let us dispense with the charades of rogue yachts and Russian self-sabotage. They were never meant to be answers. They were designed to exhaust you, to make you turn away from a truth so monstrous it feels more comfortable to ignore. The benefits do not scatter. They flow in a single, undeniable direction. They do not lead to Moscow, which lost its primary leverage over Europe and a colossal source of revenue. They do not lead to Berlin, which was plunged into an existential industrial crisis, its economic model shattered overnight. They lead, with the precision of a guided missile, directly to Washington, D.C. It is the only capital on Earth where the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines was a resounding victory on every conceivable front, geopolitical, economic, and strategic. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a confession, broadcast to the entire world before the act was even committed. Rewind to February 7, 2022. Standing beside the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, was asked about the future of Nord Stream 2 if Russia were to invade Ukraine. His response was not one of diplomatic ambiguity. It was a cold, clear promise. He leaned into the microphone and, with the quiet confidence of a man stating established policy, he said, "If Russia invades, then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it." When a reporter, astonished, asked how they could possibly do that, since the project was under German control, the president simply replied, "I promise you, we will be able to do it." This was not a gaffe. This was not an empty threat. It was a public declaration of intent. It was echoed by other architects of American foreign policy, like Under-Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, who stated with equivalent certainty just weeks earlier, if Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward. They were not hiding their plan, they were announcing it. They were building the justification, the pre-approved narrative, right before our eyes. The problem for them was that the war began, and Germany was still reluctant to permanently sever the connection. The pipeline was dormant, but not dead. It represented a future, a possibility of reconciliation, a path back to pragmatic commercial relations once the conflict subsided. For the Atlanticist hawks in Washington, this possibility was the real threat. The bridge had to be not just closed, but demolished. And so we must ask, beyond the motive and the confession, who had the means? The story of the Andromeda yacht was a deliberate insult to our intelligence, a fantasy crafted to obscure the immense technical and military sophistication required for such an attack. The operation took place in the shallow, heavily monitored waters of the Baltic Sea, on NATO Lake, under the constant watch of surveillance flights and naval patrols. To place and detonate shaped explosive charges at a depth of 80 meters, powerful enough to rupture a concrete-coated steel pipeline, is not a task for amateur scuba divers. It requires a highly trained, state-backed naval demolition unit, specialized deep-sea equipment, and the ability to operate undetected within a dense net of military surveillance. Now, look at the public, open-source flight and maritime tracking data in the days and weeks leading up to the explosions. The area around the Danish island of Bornholm, the site of the blasts, was a hive of U.S. military activity. American P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, the world's most advanced submarine hunters, circled the exact locations of the future explosions for hours on end. U.S. helicopter-carrying naval groups were operating in the immediate vicinity. To believe this was all a coincidence is to believe the arsonist just happened to be jogging past the burning building with a can of gasoline. It requires a level of naivete that the powerful rely upon. This act was the violent culmination of a decades-long American strategic objective, to prevent the union of German industry and Russian resources. This is the great fear of Anglo-American geopolitical thinkers, from Halford Mackinder to Zbigniew Brzezinski. In his book, The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski identified the Franco-German and Russo-German connections as potential challengers to American primacy over the Eurasian landmass. A sovereign Europe, powered by affordable Russian energy and led by a strong German industrial engine, is the single greatest threat to the unipolar world order Washington seeks to maintain. The Nord Stream pipeline was more than a tube of steel, it was the physical manifestation of that dreaded alliance. It was the bridge connecting the bear and the factory, and on the grand chessboard, an American eagle just used its talons to tear that bridge down. The most damning evidence of all, however, is not the naval data or the presidential promises. It is the deafening silence from Berlin and Paris. Their reaction was not one of outrage, but of quiet, fearful submission. An unprecedented act of economic warfare was committed against the industrial heart of Europe, and its leaders behaved not like victims of an attack, but like hostages acknowledging the power of their captor. This is the silence of the vassal who dares not name his master. It is the pained acceptance of a new reality, where an ally can cripple your economy with impunity, and you are expected not only to accept it, but to applaud it as an act of solidarity. The NATO alliance was redefined that day, not as a partnership of equals, but as a hierarchy of master and vassal, where the prosperity of the subject states is expendable in the service of the empire's strategic goals. This was a brutal, calculated stab in the back, executed to perfection. It permanently detached Germany from Russia, rendered Europe dependent on vastly more expensive American LNG, and achieved a core U.S. foreign policy goal, all while using a manufactured narrative to blame either the victim's neighbor or some imaginary buccaneers. But geopolitical dominance is only one side of the coin. The other side, as always, is colder, harder, and greener. The act of state-sponsored terror that deindustrialized Germany also created the single greatest market opportunity in the history of the energy trade. It opened the floodgates for a tsunami of profit. So, who precisely cashed the check written on the wreckage of Nord Stream? Follow the money. It is the oldest, simplest, and most reliable advice in any investigation. When grand narratives crumble and official stories evaporate under the faintest scrutiny, the flow of currency is a river that never lies about its destination. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines was an act of geopolitical chess, yes, but it was also the trigger for one of the most audacious and rapid transfers of wealth in modern history. The chaos in Europe was not a bug, it was the feature. While German factories powered down and European families braced for a winter of dread, a different sound could be heard across the Atlantic. It was the sound of champagne corks popping in the boardrooms of Houston and the joyful ringing of the opening bell on Wall Street for a select few. The question, cui bono, finds its most naked and unambiguous answer in the stock charts of American liquefied natural gas, LNG, exporters. Look at the graphs for companies like Cheniere Energy or Sempra Energy in the months following September 2022. You will not see a gentle rise. You will see a near vertical ascent, a spike so sharp and sudden it looks less like a market trend and more like a monument erected to celebrate a colossal victory. This was not the invisible hand of the market. This was the result of a market being taken hostage. A competitor had been violently eliminated from the board, and the American LNG producers were the only sellers left in town with the capacity to supply a desperate continent. They sold that desperation back to Europe at a premium that can only be described as predatory. They sold gas to their so-called allies at 4, sometimes 5 times the price it commanded within the United States. This wasn't commerce. It was a shakedown. Every German citizen shivering in their home, every British small business owner staring at an unpayable energy bill, was directly subsidizing the record-breaking, multi-billion-dollar profits of these corporations. Your hardship was their dividend. Yet, this monstrous profiteering required a moral justification, a noble cloak to hide the dagger. And they had one ready. A story so virtuous, so righteous, that to question it was to brand yourself a heretic. They called it the green transition. Here is where the architecture of the plan reveals its true genius. The act of sabotage was not just about securing a market, it was about leveraging a crisis to force a radical social and economic restructuring that would never be accepted in times of peace and prosperity. This is the textbook execution of the shock doctrine. First, you create the shock, the violent severing of Europe's energy lifeline. Then, you wait for the inevitable reaction, fear, panic, and a public desperate for any solution. And finally, you offer the solution you wanted all along, a forced march away from affordable energy under the banner of saving the planet. The radical green activists and their patrons in globalist institutions like the World Economic Forum did not see a catastrophe in Europe's energy crisis. They openly and repeatedly called it an opportunity to accelerate their agenda, An opportunity to finally force Europe to abandon the cheap fossil fuels that had powered its industrial might for a century. They built a moral Trojan horse. Inside it was not a cleaner future, but the deindustrialization of a primary economic rival and the imposition of a new system of energy austerity. Do not be mistaken, this is not an argument against environmental protection. It is an argument against the weaponization of environmentalism. This is a green screen, a virtuous facade painted over a ruthless agenda of control. The goal is a world where energy is no longer abundant and affordable, but scarce, expensive, and centrally managed. A world where your consumption can be tracked, measured, and, if necessary, curtailed by those who control the supply. This is the Great Reset, in practice. Using a manufactured crisis to dismantle the old order and build a new one in which you will own nothing, have no energy independence, and you will be told it is for your own good. This brings us to the document in your hand right now. Your electricity bill, your gas bill, look at the numbers, look at the price you are paying compared to 2 years ago. The media and the politicians tell you this is the price of freedom. They tell you it is your righteous contribution to the fight against tyranny or the necessary sacrifice to heal the earth. This is a lie. That exorbitant sum is not a contribution to freedom. It is an invoice. It is a bill delivered to you for the destruction of the pipeline. It is the direct transfer of your wealth, your family's security, into the pockets of the energy corporations that profited from the attack and the globalist ideologues who saw the attack as their golden opportunity. Every frantic spin of your electric meter is the sound of a cash register ringing in Houston and New York. That number on your bill is the sabotage tax you are forced to pay. It is the price of your own government's silence and submission. They have proven that they are willing to commit an act of industrial terrorism against their own allies to achieve their goals. They have proven they can cripple an entire continent's economy and then sell them the cure at an extortionate price, all while being lauded as saviors. This was not just about a pipeline. It was a message. Your prosperity is conditional. Your infrastructure is not safe. Your economic independence is a privilege they can revoke at any time. They did it with your energy. They will do it with your food, with your water, with your money. The blueprint has been tested and it was a resounding success. The greatest war being waged today is not on a foreign battlefield. It is a war against your sovereignty, your prosperity, and your freedom. It is a war to make you colder, poorer, and more dependent. We have seen who cashed the check. We have seen how the profits from American LNG corporations exploded. But if we dig just one level deeper, another question arises. Who really owns those corporations? In the next chapter, we will follow the money trail further up the ladder. And you will not be surprised to find the same familiar names, BlackRock, Vanguard, looming behind the corporate curtain. Ultimately, all roads lead back to a very small group of people who are pulling the strings.